I welcome those that have joined in the course of the presentation. Kindly introduce yourselves in the chat.
All right. Well, as many of you might know, I was the co-author with Dr. Jariva Rock on an earlier report called Mapping Financial Flows, which looked closely at where a lot of the money underwriting what's been called the Green Revolution in Africa is coming from and where it's going. And so for today, I wanted to look especially closely at the role of what are called development finance institutions, or DFIs, within what we call the Green Revolution in Africa. So what are DFIs? DFIs are banks, but importantly, they are government banks. So they're controlled by governments. They can be controlled by a single government. That would be a national DFI. Examples would be like Proparco in France or FMO in the Netherlands. Or they can be controlled by multiple governments, like the International Finance Corporation, which is part of the World Bank Group, or the African Development Bank, which you probably know. Whereas commercial banks are really out to make money, DFIs are more on a mission to invest in industries that they think will develop the local economies. So you don't see DFIs investing a whole lot in mining, for instance, but as I'll discuss, you'll see them get involved in agriculture and food processing. And in the last few years, they've greatly expanded their reach into African agriculture. So the mission of the DFIs is not just to underwrite these industries themselves, it's also to make these industries less risky so that other commercial investors can join in. Their investments typically lie in the realm of big, highly centralized projects, like processing facilities for agricultural projects, as opposed to investing in farmers directly. But more recently, they've also found ways to identify the smaller companies that are just as, if not more significant with the African Green Revolution, and distribute capital to them. So all of that has put the DFIs in the nexus of the African Green Revolution. And I would argue that they are a power center within this entire thing. It's not just where the money is, but it's also where a lot of the kind of the policy around this continent spanning project is really concentrated. So you can see on my screen now, you see a list of the different DFIs and the countries that they represent. As you can see, like a lot of them, the European countries we're talking about, and then there's also some multilateral DFIs that I mentioned. So the IFC, also one called the Green Climate Fund, which I'll discuss a little bit, and the African Development Bank. When we put it all together, it looks something like this. So you can all see this. This is a kind of a diagram of kind of how the money flows through DFIs into agribusiness. So you see foreign taxpayers give money to DFIs. The DFIs give money to companies that are at the forefront of the African Green Revolution. You can see kind of on the upper right that we've made a note about what are called intermediaries. That's banks, private equity funds. That's an important part of this whole thing, and I'll talk about them in a moment. I'll talk briefly before that about the multilateral DFIs. You can see here where about half the money for the two of the DFIs that are instrumental to financing the African Green Revolution come from. So as you can see, the amount of money from each country, as you can see, the money, the way that the power is decided within these multilateral DFIs, it happens because the different countries contribute different amounts, and then they have a proportionate voting power. So as you can see, like in the African Development Bank, for instance, like Nigeria is the largest contributor, and they have the largest voting power. A country like Mauritania or Madagascar is also a contributor to the African Development Bank, but they contribute less money, they have less voting power. African Development Bank, as you can see, also has a lot of donors outside of Africa. So After Nigeria, the largest donor to the African Development Bank is the United States, and they have a proportionate amount of voting power. So DFIs have a few different ways to finance private enterprise in Africa. A few decades ago, a DFI like the International Finance Corporation really only financed the private sector by giving money to companies directly in the form of loans. That would be called direct financing, and DFIs still do that. For my report, I looked at what the DFIs have done from 2019 on, since that covers the time since the early report that I co-wrote with Joeva Rock. And so in that time, the IFC alone has invested over $2 billion directly in agribusiness and related industries, like food processing in sub-Saharan Africa. The African Development Bank has invested nearly $900 million. And to emphasize, this is the amount of capital invested in, so the amount of capital that these banks have invested directly in agribusiness and related industries in Africa that I was able to identify. But these days, along with giving money to companies directly, DFIs also give money to commercial entities. And then those commercial entities then pass the money on to other companies. So these commercial entities are what are called financial intermediaries. And by building up a network of financial intermediaries, DFIs have given themselves a way to see the landscape of small and medium-sized companies and then deliver money to them. And I want to stress this concept of seeing the medium-sized companies. So, the DFIs, the people who are running them are based in, the IFC is based in Washington, D.C., Proparco is in Paris, British International Investment, another big one tied to the British government, that's in London. The staff there, they're economists largely. There are some agricultural specialists. They certainly, in their mind, they see a lot of investment opportunities in Africa, but kind of seeing the actual companies themselves, literally identifying them, recognizing them, kind of seeing what their potential and kind of figuring out ways to channel money into them. That is difficult from a US or European capital. But by working with commercial banks on the ground, local institutions that can assist them, they can, those institutions can then, they can give them money, and then those institutions can pass the money on to those local institutions. So commercial banks, one kind of financial intermediary. The DFIs will sometimes just give banks money to lend to companies. The IFC has lent money to, for instance, Access Bank Ghana and Chorus Bank in Guinea, Benin, and Cote d'Ivoire, specifically to, they've given them money specifically to give money to companies in agribusiness in their local jurisdictions, their own local jurisdictions. More often, though, DFIs will provide banks with what are called guarantees or risk-sharing agreements so that the bank can lend its own money to different companies. And then if the companies default on their loans, the DFI will cover the losses. And so that is very serious support that the DFIs provide. And it allows those banks to take more risks and to lend more money that they might not otherwise. Although it is not, in the case of a guarantee or a risk-sharing agreement, it is not a direct transference of money on part of the DFI to the bank. And that is an important distinction. Another type of financial intermediary is a private equity fund, which works in a similar way, and I'll talk about what that means in a minute. But one thing I want to note here is that when DFIs support a financial intermediary, food and agriculture is usually only one part of what the bank or the private equity fund is doing. So for that reason, we can't know how much money is going to agribusiness through these channels. We can only kind of know that the total amount of money that they give to a bank or a private equity fund, and that could be, tens or hundreds of millions of dollars for in each case. We don't know exactly kind of what proportion of that is going to agribusiness specifically. Some of it could be going to build hotels or schools or some kind of other infrastructure project that is not directly related or even related at all to agribusiness. But in any case, secondary financing is a big part of how DFIs are underwriting the green revolution in Africa. So what is a private equity fund? I won't get into the details too much right now, but the main thing to remember is that the instrument of investment is called a fund. DFIs invest in funds, but then something else called the manager or the general partner usually decides how to spend that money. So the fund secures money from other investors, and then it invests, other than the DFI, then it invests the money in companies and provides technical advice to the company along with that money. If they buy a company outright, they can just make decisions for it. So private equity has been instrumental in identifying small enterprises that are active in food processing, retail in Africa. By investing in them and asserting influence over them, they make them compatible with the global financial system by making sure they adhere to certain international standards of bookkeeping or food safety or packaging or marketing. They can take a company that may be successful and in its own right, in its own area, and turn it into something that is both successful and recognizable to investors in the US and Europe. And it's for this reason that we can say that private equity funds are really instrumental to the financialization of African agriculture. But when we look at who stands behind those funds in Africa, those private equity funds, we see a familiar face, and it's the DFIs. And what do these relationships look like in practice? So I'll give you an example. Starting around 2016, about 30 investors backed a PE fund, private equity fund called Agro-Capital 4. And 8 of those investors were DFIs. In fact, more than 40% of all the money for this one fund came from DFIs. You can see what each of those funds contributed here. So you can see it's like the IFC alone gave 20 million euros. British International Investment, that's a UK fund, that's the UK DFI. Bio, that's the Belgian DFI. These all contributed pretty substantial sums of money. The smallest contribution came from the German DFI DEG for 2 million euros. Altogether, the DFIs contributed almost 100 million euros, which is more than 40% of the total that went into this one fund. And the other investors were what are called, quote, high net worth individuals, wealthy families. We don't know anything more about them or other than that. Private equity is notoriously opaque. It's rare that they'll say anything about their investors, except when their investors are DFIs. And funds in Africa typically enjoy the support of at least one DFI, as Agro-Capital 4 did. And if you've gone grocery shopping in Nairobi recently, you've likely seen the result of that relationship. So in 2019, Agro-Capital 4 loaded up on DFI Capital, and then they bought a company called Quickmart, which is a Kenyan supermarket chain. They merged that chain with another smaller chain called Tumaini. It's a smaller chain, also in Kenya. So Quickmart is now a really fast-growing supermarket chain in Kenya. It might be the fastest growing in Kenya. And that's largely thanks to the DFIs. DFI-backed private equity also underwrote the expansion of Naivas, which is another supermarket chain in Kenya. A similar operation led to the expansion of an Egyptian supermarket chain called Kazian into Morocco. There's some other examples. The bigger picture is that we're really seeing the consolidation of African agricultural retail. And that has a very serious and very direct implications for African farmers. Supermarket consolidation means depressed purchasing prices for farmers, new costs for farmers in the form of fees and conditions that they have to meet to sell to supermarkets. For both those reasons, supermarkets also generally prefer to deal with large farms because they can keep prices low, and large farms can keep the prices low and absorb the added cost. And that's a pattern we've seen repeatedly in the United States and in Europe and in South Africa. And we're likely to see it in Kenya as well as chains like Quick Mart get bigger and take up a larger and larger share of food retail in the country. And the reason that that's happening at all is largely thanks to private equity, but even more fundamentally to DFIs. So at this point, you might be wondering what, if anything, we might be able to do to lessen the influence of DFIs on African agriculture. When you look at the different actors that are perpetuating the African Green Revolution, you see African commercial banks, private equity funds, African governments, African agribusiness and food processing and retail companies, philanthropies, like the Gates Foundation. Most of those different actors are hard to access, but in one form or another, the DFIs touch all of them. And unlike them, they are set up to at least hear complaints from the public. So DFIs typically have something called a complaints mechanism. That's an office, usually independent from the DFI itself, that hears grievances from people affected by a project that the DFI financed. So how does the complaints mechanism work? Well, DFIs have codes of ethics regarding the environment and social welfare that they require anyone receiving their money to adhere to. The way it's set up, people affected by a project the DFI financed can go to the complaints mechanism and tell them that a given project violated that code of conduct. Um, and so in theory, it all sounds nice. There's just a few problems. One is that filing a complaint can get a little complicated. The complaints mechanisms typically um, require uh, they require affected people to submit a lot of evidence. The questions can be very legalistic. The form, that you would fill out is very legalistic, and even though they are open to anyone affected, they're typically expecting not to hear from ordinary people, but from attorneys. And so even when the system works, it can be very slow. It can take years for complaints mechanisms to review and process a grievance and pay the people owed restitution. And when we talk about secondary financing, this whole matter can get even more complicated because having that intermediary, like a bank or a private equity fund, between the project and the DFI can make the chain of responsibility that should link the DFI to the project more murky and therefore more complicated. And there's a bigger issue, and that is complaints mechanisms are really only supposed to intervene when the DFI does something that it's not supposed to do. But so much of what we recognize as a totally shameful result, consolidation of the market, building up systems that are hostile to small farmers and great for very large ones, et cetera, et cetera. Those aren't unintended consequences on part of the DFIs. They are the DFIs doing exactly as they are supposed to do. So DFIs might be based in Paris and London or Washington, D.C. They may seem far removed from Africa, but they're quite involved in African agriculture. The trouble is that DFIs really aren't getting involved in African agriculture to help small farmers. They are at best out to use small farmers for the betterment of agro industries. And even when they themselves are out of the picture, they have proxies like banks and private equity funds that are a lot closer. And the combined weight of their capital is enormous, and we should not, and we cannot underestimate their capacity and their will to transform African agriculture. So, Bridget, I'll turn it over to you then.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Alex, for that very eye-opening presentation. And also, if you have a question that has come up in the course of the presentation from Alex, please write it in the chat or give it a bit of time. We'll give you an opportunity to ask your questions or share your comments. But I will first invite our other speakers, two speakers, starting with Mutinta. I already introduced you, but I'll ask you to speak a bit about some of the research you've been doing, how DFIs are driving corporate consolidation in Zambia's agriculture sector. Give us some, examples, some insights of what's happening on the ground and what the implications are for state sovereignty and for smallholder farmers. So Mutinta, if you can keep it within 10 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Bridget, and good afternoon. So one of the things that we have in this country, in Zambia, is the Farmer Input Support Program. I think most African countries have these. And one of the things that we believe as ZAAB is that this is a vehicle actually for consolidating corporate power over our food systems. And typical examples actually are that despite the fact that our agricultural sector hasn't been performing well, and in terms of the key indicators around delivering nutrition, delivering food security, ensuring environmental sustainability, we have, even as recent as the 2023-2024 agricultural budget, where 81% of the total budget went to the provision of PCP inputs, that is the seeds and the fertilizers. And this is a subsidy program that is funded by the government. For seeds, for example, there is a total value of 1.37 billion, which is approximately USD 50 million, which is 42% of the value that went to 3 companies. These now are listed as Zambian companies, that is Kamano Seed, Farmers Ban Limited, and Zambezi Seed. We are particularly interested in the Kamano Seed, which is an indigenous and women-led organization that works with smallholder farmers. And these got quite a substantial amount of this 42%. They got the highest of the 42%, and they supplied 92% of the open pollinated varieties of maize. But open pollinated varieties of maize seed only made up 5% of all maize seed procured. So you see that even when you see there's Zambian companies are participating, and there is an introduction of open pollinated seed, which wasn't there, by the way, many years ago. This was recently introduced. We still get more of hybrids. And when we talk about hybrids, we are really talking about, you know, the corporate sector having more power over our seed and food system. And we also know that there are other programs, also similar programs within government, that have become a vehicle for ensuring that the private sector is leading in the food systems. And one of that is also the development of the comprehensive agriculture transformation support program, the CATSIP, which is our framework, our agriculture investment framework for the next 10 years, where the theory of change begins by saying, you know, government will provide an enabling environment for private sector too, and everything else follows. So you can already see that our vision, our thrust currently in the next 10 years is to enable private sector to, you know, lead in the provision, in the production, marketing, and you know, everything else to do with the food system. When we come to FDIs, we know that several billions of dollars have been injected in Zambia's broader agricultural sector by institutional investors over the last decade in various forms, be it grants, loans, credit lines, and these are either direct or indirectly through investment schemes and risk-sharing mechanisms with commercial banks. Some key institutions that have, you know, injected FDIs into Zambia in the agriculture sector include the World Bank, the European Union, the UN's Green Climate Fund, GIZ, the German Development Agency, and many others. But yeah, just to give an example of how this pans out, we see that one of the recipients of contracts to supply inputs to underfeeds in Zambia in the 2023-2024 season is the Export Trading Company Limited, Zambia, which is a subsidiary of a multi-million-dollar global conglomerate, Export Trading Group, ETG. Now, this ETG has received $100 million from development financing institutions, such as the Dutch FMO, the World Bank's International Finance Corporation, British International Investment, BII, the African Development Bank, and the OPEC Fund for International Development, among others. And in November 2024 alone, ETG received $394 million for a 3-year sustainability-linked loan financed by a syndicate of institutions. And many of these are aimed at incentivizing African farmers to take up certain technologies and use more of the chemical fertilizers, or use more of the technologies that are being developed for the farmers. The other one is ZAAB. We have a company in Zambia called ZAAB, which was initially a Zambian company, but now being sold, it was sold, and it is owned, the major shareholder in ZAAB is the Silverlands 2 Fund, which is a co-investment fund ultimately owned by the British private equity firm Silver Street Capital. And these are the companies that are mainly benefiting by getting contracts from government under the FISIP, and they have received a lot of money in terms of FDIs. So Silverland actually claims to double food production by introducing rotational crops, better quality inputs, and through extension work. And also estimates that the food produced by its investments are sufficient to provide for 2.7 million people for a year. So they also have a variety of other investments in Zambia and Sub-Saharan Africa through their Silverlands 1 and Silverlands 2 and 3 funds, with 11 portfolio companies invested in across 8 countries. So you can see that these are quite big, actually, overreaching across Southern Africa, across other regions also, and also getting a lot of funds through FDIs in the name of agricultural development or supporting the introduction of appropriate technologies. Now, these are not isolated cases. And since I only have 10 minutes, I'll speak about the fact that there are many others that are participating, but we see that our food system in Zambia still fails to deliver on intended outcomes, including food and nutrition security, environmental sustainability, economic viability for the smallholder farmers. We feel that we can call out these people, actually. We can hold them accountable somehow. And one of the ways is what was done with Agra, for example, mounting a multi-level kind of campaign. And we can see that they have somehow succumbed to pressure. And by the way, I got a call that somebody wants to talk to ZAAB from Agra. So it's really interesting that we are getting to make inroads. So there is a global campaign against Agra, and also local campaigns. Like in Zambia, we've been running some campaigns that call out the fact that Agra has been unable to deliver on its own promises. But it's also possible through the kind of research that we are doing to demonstrate that there is no value for money, comparing the resources that are being spent versus the gains that we are seeing now. I'll also talk a little bit about what we think would be an alternative. For example, what would a farmer-centered alternative look like? We believe that a farmer-centered alternative would be one that supports farmer control over the means of production, including the seeds. And also this supported and promoted by appropriate policies and programs, government programs. We also believe that programs and policies in a farmer-centered system have to be developed with the farmers, both with them and for them, as well as based on their needs, their identified needs. We also believe that the farmer-centered system would be one where food systems are localized and they promote appropriate technologies rather than technologies developed outside and exported into African countries for farmers to uptake. Women-centered, and also because we know that women are the majority of smallholder farmers, and therefore a farmer-centered system would be one that looks at the needs of the women and prioritizes these. And also the fact that we can change this narrative. We can change this narrative. I've already spoken about the research, which is already bringing out key issues that we can address through lobbying to government and other stakeholders, including the funders that are providing these FDIs, but also proposing alternatives like agroecology. Because even as we critique the model that is currently existing, we need to provide alternatives and of course emphasizing issues around the social justice issues, economic viability, environmental sustainability in the face of climate change. But we also know that we need to pay attention. If we have to change this narrative, we need to look at the multi-level nature of this challenge. Who do we talk to? We talk to the organizations that are the CSOs that are within our country, so that we strengthen the voice. We talk to the government. We talk to the institutions and these bilaterals and multilaterals that are funding this model of agriculture, and call them out. I think one of the things is that we have the institutions like the EU, where they have direct policies. Hello? Yeah, we have institutions that we can speak to directly about what kind of model of agriculture they are funding and how this is impacting both smallholder farmers, but also generally the general populace. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mutinta, for those very clear examples, and of course also sharing what we can do about it, what alternative we are proposing. Yes, I will now invite Anne to come in. So Anne, if you may come in for, within 10 minutes, just speak about some of the research and the work you're doing in Kenya around agricultural financing and how external funders, especially DFIs, are shaping national policies and what this means for food sovereignty and biodiversity in Kenya. Anne, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Bridget. I think I'd like to thank the previous speakers for setting the tune very, very well. I want to begin by saying that Kenya is actually a leader in the East Africa region, where a lot of these DFIs are very keen to influence or to come in and put in resources to influence the agriculture sector. When we did the pilot study, one of the things that we found out was that a lot of the funding, for example, coming through the AGRA, the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, was not coming in as small money, but came in even as direct injection into the Treasury or the Ministry of Finance as development aid. The aim then being to influence the process of policy change. And 20 years ago is when we are seeing that we see that policies were being changed. For example, that's when we had a review of our Seed and Plant Varieties Act, and it was reviewed. Money was put into the Ministry of Agriculture, And the kind of it conformed now to UP of 1991, which is very restrictive also in terms of farmers. You know, the case in Kenya where farmers are treated as they cannot be breeders and they cannot share freely their seed. A major challenge which we have challenged as the Biodiversity and Biosafety of Society Association of Kenya and others in court, seeking a constitutional interpretation of what our constitution, which is very protective of indigenous knowledge, indigenous seed, as opposed to the Seed Act. What is very interesting, if you look at the aspects of seed, is that just this week, we have received a notice from our parliament where there's a proposal to review our seed, the Seed and Plant Varieties Act, Amendment 2025. We read a lot of mischief in this because when you look at the review, one of the things that is being suggested is moving the process of approval of new seed varieties from the Kenya Plant Health Inspectorate Services, which usually takes about 2 to 4 years to look at a new seed, conduct national performance trials and all that, and moving it to the Kenya Bureau of Standards, KEBS. And in KEBS, there is a implication that it will now take 4 to 6 months before a new seed is being introduced. You have to look at this in tandem or with the issue of the push for genetically engineered crops in Kenya. Kenya has been at the forefront. We have BT cotton already in the market, but also a lot of research going on and application for example, BT maize, GM maize, which is actually now undergoing national performance trials. And one of the aspects is that there's been a big push by industry to bring in the GMOs in the country. And one of the stumbling blocks for them was the process of where a seed has to be taken for about 2 to 3 years, national performance trials. And the influence that we are seeing industry having in this process is that this change, the proposed change in our Seed Act, may open doors easily for the introduction of GMOs in the country. And the push by industry, which in Kenya is led by the Seed Trade Association of Kenya, STAC. We also see that through the DFIs, there's been a lot of resources that have been pumped even into so-called local banks in the country, which give agriculture loans. And what is interesting in that is that the agriculture loan is not given in cash. You go get your voucher, collect the seed. Of course, often it will be hybrid, maize as it is. Then later go collect the fertilizer and the herbicides, the pesticides that you may require. And so you see a lot of influence of industry, especially in the seed sector in the country. And the change of laws is one of the processes that was influenced by AGRA, which is also happening even with the fertilizer and the input subsidy program, where there's the government has been putting in a lot of resources to purchase fertilizers every season for the community. But now what is very interesting, like one of the local banks was getting even funds from the Africa Development Bank, the French Development Bank, which I think Alex spoke about, to control or to influence agriculture. And talking about now we need to focus on agribusiness for development and not just so-called smallholder farmers. And so you're seeing a big push towards that. When you look at, for example, even among the donors, I think several years since about maybe 5 or 6 years ago, like the Dutch have been talking about, to no longer be giving aid for just anything. We need to give aid for trade. And so that hinge or that focus on using trade to be able to benefit by giving aid to Africa. Under in Kenya, we also have what we call the Rural Agriculture Sector Working Group by various donor agencies. USAID was very loud and a key figure in this, influencing the processes. But now with the death of USAID, there are also the others who are continuing. But you also see an influence of research, and even within our research institutions, national research institutions, like the Kenya Agriculture and Livestock Research Organization, which has a lot of funding coming from corporates to influence even the research that's going on in terms of GMOs. Biggest challenge being that the research organizations often don't get funding for research, and so industry comes in and fills in that gap. You look at it, even the influence has gone further, even to the the National Biosafety Authority, the Pest Control and Products Board. These are the regulators for GMO introduction, and National Biosafety Authority, Pest Control and Products Board for highly hazardous pesticide. And so even in terms of even funding that comes from some of the donor agencies, some few years back, we had a big locust invasion, and the amount of pesticides that were being pumped into the country and coming through official development assistance was quite shocking, and some of it was really being misused. And in one area in Kenya, the amount of pesticide sprayed was like 10 times, which affected even the bees. This area had a huge production of honey, and the honey production went down. When you look at, for example, at the regional front, there's a lot of influence coming in through the regional bodies like the East Africa community, which is influencing or pushing for harmonization of policies. And the challenge with harmonization is that once we embrace harmonization, everything that comes in through Kenya, you don't have to go through a process of approval in Uganda or Tanzania or members of the East Africa community. That's also happening at the COMESA, the COMESA region, even at the SADC region. Regarding the issue of also research, there is a lot of money being put into research in our local universities, sponsoring PhD, doctorate students, master students, and that in turn influences the kind of thinking that we have. When we look at issues of even the climate change, carbon markets has been a key area where the government has even gone ahead and changed our climate policy so that we can open markets for these companies that want to start trading in carbon in the country. And you know, this is one of the 4 solutions that is out there where when you look at the benefit to the farmer is very minimal. And we're seeing some areas, for example, in the areas like in one of the counties in Kajiado in Kenya, where communities were told that they were going to benefit, but they lost even access to their land because it became that now it is enclosed for the wild animals. Alex also spoke about the issue of the Agro-Capital for buying Quickmart and Tumaini supermarket. This is, you're seeing a lot of influence in terms of digital agriculture and how it's influencing even the purchasing of these products from the companies. But what is worse is that how the human rights perspective in the supermarket, because once they were purchased, now the companies began to outsource the staff who sell at this supermarket. And so you're seeing issues of long working hours and staff being not benefiting, a lot of exploitation of staff. We've also done work on digital agriculture and the influence that it is having. In one of the counties we did in Makueni County, we could see that there were different apps being used. And in this is one of the counties that's focused on by philanthropy, the Gates Foundation. And the kind of data that was being collected from farmers was not just on agriculture. They were checking on what's your family size, taking coordinates of the land, infringing on so much privacy. And you wonder, when this information is collected, who's going to benefit from it? And so when you look at the influence of also the back companies, not only from those that are funded by even government, you find that the DFIs also have an influence on that. If you look at the companies that are now investing in terms of aggregation of products, they are supported by the DFIs. And at the end of the day, the smallholder farmer is locked out of the value chain process, and their benefit is much reduced. But all is not doom. Kenya is one of the first countries in the world where we have done an agroecology strategy and launched it in November 2024. And this is going to influence the way we approach agroecology. At the county level, we have 3 counties now that have approved agroecology policies. We have Murang'a County in 2022, Vihiga County this year, 2025, and just last week, West Pokot County. And this is going to have really an impact in terms of how we move forward, but we really need to continue to be keen. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anne, and to also Mutinta and Alex, the first 2 speakers. So we'll now open it up for the audience. If you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand, and I'll give you the opportunity to speak and ask your question. If you have a question, address it to a specific speaker, if possible. And yeah, try to be precise. Josephine, you have the floor.
Ok, donc ma question s'adresse à Anne Maïna. Elle a parlé des politiques sous-régionales, de l'harmonisation des politiques sous-régionales. J'aurais souhaité avoir quelques précisions sur les impacts de l'harmonisation des politiques sous-régionales sur les intrants et les semences au Kenya. Quels sont les impacts que les politiques sous-régionales ont au niveau du pays? Merci.
Yes, Francois, I suspect this is Honorable Francois. Please unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. My dear sister Bridget Mugambe, and the entire team of AFSA and our stakeholders. I hope I'm audible.
Yeah, you are.
Yeah, actually, it's not a question. It's just an appreciation to all our stakeholders that are engaged in supporting Africa when it comes to food system transformation. And remember, I'm a member of parliament at the East African Legislative Assembly. My name is Francoise Umuchiza. And I'm just here to add on the presentation, especially on behalf of Zimbabwe and Kenya, whereby agroecology is a part of strategic priorities. Yeah, in short, the approach integrates ecological and social principles into farming practices to address challenges like food insecurity, environmental degradation, and poverty. All of this, they are leading to food security and environmental sustainability and economic development. And when we talk of agroecology, of course, it's an initiative that has started. Like Kenya said, they already have counties that joined the policy, which is good. So at the EALA, I want to register that members of parliament of the East African Legislative Assembly approved the motion I moved. Now a resolution of the entire house binding to partner states to also support agroecology. As also they will be supporting their GDP, not only GDP, but also the African values, African identity, because agroecology, when we support our seeds, for instance, farmer managed seeds system, we will be supporting our small scale holder farmers, as they were mentioned earlier. So I'm not here to ask a question, but I would like to commend the organizers of this meeting and also all participants for coming on board. Let's work together to make sure we push this agenda forward to make changes. And with the agroecology, questions about pesticides that are harmful to us, to the environment, to livestock, they will be resolved immediately. It will be automatic if we support agroecology. So thank you very much. I want just to add those inputs, and I thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Honorable. There are some questions in the chat, but I'll give Jean. Jean, if you can please speak, ask your question. make your comment.
OK, merci beaucoup. Moi, c'est Jeanne Zungi-Epon. Je suis professeure titulaire de génétique et amélioration des plantes et je suis du Bénin. Ma question s'adresse à l'oratrice du Zimbabwe et à la sœur Anne du Kenya. Vraiment, félicitations pour ce que vous faites là-bas. Mais je suis restée un peu sur ma faim. Parce que la Zimbabwe nous a parlé de 92 variétés de maïs que l'on retrouve sur le marché et principalement des variétés hybrides. Mais elle ne nous a pas vraiment parlé des organismes génétiquement modifiés. Et Anne a brossé rapidement le tableau en ce qui concerne la poussée du gouvernement pour introduire les OGM au Kenya. J'étais au Kenya il n'y a pas longtemps, j'étais au Zimbabwe également et j'ai vu du maïs sur le marché. Ma question est celle-ci. Est-ce que dans ces deux pays-là, nous n'avons pas du maïs génétiquement modifié qui circule sur le marché? Le maïs que moi j'ai vu là-bas, d'accord, il y a des hybrides parmi ces maïs-là, mais est-ce qu'il n'y a pas du maïs génétiquement modifié au Zimbabwe et au Kenya? C'est ma question. Merci beaucoup.
Yes, so the question from DRC and Egypt, Lambert and Mares, they're asking how these funds get to NGOs, small NGOs, how they access these funds. So maybe Alex, you could speak a bit to that process. Then Jean, you've asked your question again from Alberto. The question is to Anne. Can you talk a little bit more about the regional agroecology strategies that you've just mentioned as you concluded your talk? Yeah, so I'll give our panelists an opportunity to please come in. Maybe Alex, we could start with you, then Anne, then Mutinta.
So, and the question is about whether civil service or organizations civil society organizations can receive DFI money.
Yeah, how they, well, I guess it would be about the process of how this money gets to NGOs, if it does get to NGOs in a way.
Right. DFIs aren't usually financing NGOs so much. They are they're financing for-profit or operations and financial intermediaries like banks and private equity funds. So yeah, it's generally that funding is generally not available. Some civil service organizations, sometimes civil society organizations will sometimes contract with DFI to, conduct research or to kind of help implement some project. But yeah, I think generally that's not where the money is going. I think though that this is, because this is such a vast source of capital and it is intended for African agriculture, I think it is worth, asking the DFIs why not, finance them, why not support agroecology, that kind of thing. But I think generally there isn't like a way to apply for it outright.
Thank you so much. Dan, you had a number of questions. You could please speak to them.
Thank you very much. I think one of the questions that was asked was by Josephina Tangana about the sub-regional policy and also to touch on the issues of harmonization, which I think Honorable Francois also touched on. One of the things that we realize in Kenya is that and I think in most of the countries, government works through policies. If you don't influence the policy, then there's no funding application that can be done by government. And so we began through various multi-stakeholder platforms to reach out to the government and various ministries like the Ministry of Agriculture and the Environment. And that's when in the last 3 years, we worked on a national agroecology strategy, which would define what we mean by agroecology. And we are now even working on a implementation framework so that we can begin implementation. But Kenya has also 47 counties, which are sub-regional governments that are headed by governors. And you can also cascade or even develop a policy at the county level. And so we worked with Murang'a, which was the first county in the country. Even before we got the National Agroecology Strategy, Murang'a had its policy in 2022, which has become a learning center or an example on how the processes of agroecology are influencing even government allocation to funding. Then the other counties we are working in, several actually in process. We're expecting before the end of the month also to launch one in Makueni County. And so when you define what you mean by agroecology, the processes, you look at the principles, the elements of agroecology, the levels of agroecology, then you can be able to guide even the farmers and even the local government in terms of how we will transition to agroecology. And that's been very successful, and we are learning quite a lot even in the process. And it's something that I think many countries, I know Benin also, have something going there, Togo, and other countries that are working, Uganda also working on an agroecology policy. When you talk about the regional and harmonization of policies, I was talking about there are several processes. A good one at the yellow level, which Honorable Francois has talked about, is the agroecology support for agroecology. But also, like even in Kenya, apart from having the agroecology policy, the government is keen to push GMOs in the country. So you find that at the regional level, under biosafety, where GMOs are located, and the issues of seeds, there are also processes to push GMOs and the commercialization of seeds in the different countries. The risk of a harmonized policy, for example, in the East Africa region, is that, and this is what is being pushed by a lot of the seed companies, is that if we belong to the East Africa community, and a GMO seed is approved in Uganda, then when it comes to Kenya, it doesn't need to go through any approval process. What I was talking about, national performance trials, issues of being conducted to see the efficacy, it can easily cross. And that is very risky at the regional level because it will influence processes. So we are seeing harmonization being pushed on issues of seeds and the issues of genetically engineered crops, which is one thing that's dangerous. And maybe we can work with Honorable Francois and the Agriculture Committee at the East Africa Legislative Assembly to see how best to stop that process. Jean from Benin has asked question about GMOs in the market. In Kenya, the only GMO now commercialized in the country is BT cotton, GMO cotton. There is a big push and there's a lot of research going on maize, cassava, cowpeas, even animal GMOs, for example, to deal with issues of the sleeping sickness in the cattle. And so that officially there are no GMOs, but as an organization that has been challenging GMOs in the country from as far back as 2004, we did a random test as far back as 2007 and collected samples of maize seed being sold in the market. One we picked from a town called Eldoret was labeled hybrid from South Africa. When we tested it, it was positive for GMO because we even sent it to Germany. We worked with Greenpeace to do further analysis. It was actually GMO. And so there are cases of contamination, but our law also looks at that issues of how you deal with contamination and the fines that you can pay. Jean-Baptiste asked about how do funds get to NGOs. USAID was a good example before it collapsed because USAID was very clear in terms of its position of GMOs and the push for pesticides, herbicides, and all this, and also other organizations that are coming in. There are also NGOs formed basically to push the GMO agenda, for example, the AATF and all those. So I think I'll give a chance to the rest of the colleagues to answer the other questions.
Thanks a lot, Anne. Yeah, Mutinta, if you could just come in and speak a bit about the GMOs in Zambian market. I think that was one question from Jane, but you could also make a comment on the other questions.
Yeah, so as far as we know, there are no GMOs in Zambia. And I want to correct that it's not Zimbabwe, it's actually Zambia. And that's because up to now, our policy, our draft policy, which was revised with the intention of allowing living genetically modified organisms in Zambia, has not yet been approved. There have been, of course, rumors of trials being done here, there, but in the absence of the policy that would authorize those, it's very difficult to track who is doing what. So it's possible, like Annie says, that there could be some loopholes where GMOs have entered and they're being planted, but we cannot prove that. So as far as we are concerned, Zambia still doesn't allow living genetically modified organisms. That means any seeds, plant propagation material, anything that can be planted or propagated is not allowed up to now. So yeah, the reference to hybrid versus open pollinated seeds is that for small scale farmers, open pollinated seeds are actually the ones that they keep, because they can replant, they can reuse, which means they're able to continue with their farmer managed seed systems of sharing, selecting, sharing, and reusing, while hybrids cannot be reused, which means they remain under the corporate, they remain hooked onto this corporate system where they have to buy seed every year. But I also want to comment a little bit on the FDIs and whether they reach the NGOs. In Zambia, these would be very few. So most of these resources are used directly by the institutions receiving them, and in the name of providing extension, improved technologies such as improved seeds, which are in most cases hybrids. Also talking about enhanced market access. Actually, in Zambia, the market issue is very big. So most of these institutions that are receiving these funds are investing in developing markets in agriculture, generally improving the way this food system is managed in Zambia. But again, we see that even when these resources that are coming continue to strengthen the corporate power over our food system, we still don't get, the food system is still not able to deliver on the food security. We had a drought last year during the 2023 and 2024 rainy season. We had a drought, and just one drought actually hit us so bad that many regions were declared food insecure. We had hunger, serious hunger in Zambia, where we actually received relief food from cooperating partners and other African countries. So this is a clear testimony that despite all these funds and the millions of dollars that have been invested in improving production methods, introducing new technologies, the improved seeds, our system is not resilient, but all it does is that it gives power to the corporate sector, and they're the ones that are benefiting. Like I said, 2 examples of international companies that received contracts from the government subsidy, despite them having a lot of resources from foreign institutions for FDI. So you get this kind of dynamic where those who have money will have more, and therefore they wield more power over the food system. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mutinta. As we prepare to wrap up, just to inform the participants, we do have the report available in English and French. It's online. The link is being shared in the chat. It has been shared, and Michael will share it again. So please feel free to download the report and read it. We will now do our final wrap up. I don't see many other questions. I see, yes, sorry. A question here from Sol. I'm sorry, I must be mispronouncing your name. Sole, farmer seeds taken into account in the sub-region seed laws. Mutinta, as you wrap up, if you could speak to that a bit, but not now, maybe in your wrap up. Then, yeah, for Lawrence is asking about what the alternatives are to industrial agriculture and factory farming. Would it be helpful to have DFI support, and through what financing mechanisms? Yes, so Alex, if you could speak a bit to this. Also, Anne, you can speak to this, alternatives to industrial agriculture and factory farming, but also if it's helpful to have DFI support and mechanisms. And then Clemens, I think this is a comment. GMOs and chemical inputs can distort local markets, making it challenging for agroecological products to compete. Okay, the question is here, what strategies can be implemented to support agroecological products on the markets? So Anne and Mutinta, if you could, Anne or Mutinta, if you could speak to this in your wrap up. So we will have systematic wrap up in the order of which we made our presentations. Alex, I'll give you the first opportunity. And as you respond to that question, please also use this opportunity to just speak a bit about the book that you're working on, the Agenda Around Fast Foods. I know there is a link also to DFIs. Just take a minute to also speak to that. And yeah, I hope catch our interest in that. And then after that, we'll have Mutinta and I'll give you 2 minutes. I hope that will be enough for everyone to wrap up.
Lot to cover in 2 minutes. Let's see if I can get through it. Well, I'll let Anna and Mutinta speak to the kind of the nature of the alternatives. I mean, we talked about agroecology, you know, and there's a lot to be said there. I do wonder if the agroecology model is actually at all compatible with DFIs, just because the DFIs are prioritizing, I mean, they're instruments of capitalism and they are about scale. They're about scale, they're about profitability, they're about kind of generating, well, they're really about, like, to the degree that they're interested in agriculture in Africa, and they are very interested in agriculture in Africa. They're interested in turning the natural resources of soil, of water, of and to a lesser extent labor, you know, human capital, into, you know, tradable financial assets. So it's kind of hard, you know, to kind of go to an institution that is really interested in doing that and saying, well, we have an agroecology project that, you know, maybe you can finance for us, because so I think there is a fundamental issue of compatibility. You know, if that money is available, then great, but I don't know that we can really count on it to be available, and so I think like that there is but the agroecology model is not a capital intensive model, so I think, you know, to kind of extend it around Africa to kind of ensure that it gets the traction that it deserves. I mean, I think that maybe the issue isn't so much that it needs like more money. You know, it needs policy changes. It needs, you know, but as you know, um, as we discussed, I mean, it is that kind of the DFIs do influence policy, and so that is, so in that way, it's worth perhaps kind of going to them and telling them, like, you know, you need to kind of like use your authority to kind of use your power to influence governments, national governments in Africa to kind of like embrace agroecology, and then, you know, whether or not it's going to, you know, there's some profit margin in here. But that's kind of two faces of DFI. You know, there's the policy side, there's the capital side. And so like the capital side, I don't know that it has anything to offer. But you know, that said, I think it is like it connects to really everything in this way. You know, everything is kind of comes back to a certain logic. You know, there's a certain logic of agriculture. There's a certain logic that says that like agriculture is really about making money. It's not about feeding people. Feeding people is kind of secondary. And so that is so Bridget, you asked about my book, and I think that the book about, you know, what I've learned from studying fast food is that like that kind of the logic of capital, it runs deep in our agricultural systems, and so that's kind of where, in a sense, that is where the fast food industry comes from. But there's a lot more I could say about that, certainly, but I'll let someone else speak now.
Thank you so much, and please do feel free to share that book when it's ready. Tinta, if you can just wrap up your last comments, and yeah, then we'll have Anne.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'll just add to what Alex has said regarding the DFIs and agroecology. Of course, in their current form, the way they are framed now, it's not possible for them to be compatible with agroecology. But given the resources that that these institutions have at their disposal, if those resources were committed to facilitating the transition to sustainable food systems, I think they would be most helpful, because it's quite a lot of money that goes into industrial agriculture, which is still unable to deliver what agriculture is supposed to deliver: food security, environmental sustainability, nutrition, and everything else, and economic gains, of course, for smallholder farmers who still remain very poor. So that would be my take on the compatibility between agroecology and DFIs. Regionally, in terms of farmer seed systems, I think there is increasing recognition of the role that farmer seed systems play in food security, in preserving diversity, crop diversity, because the current system actually pushes for these monocultures that are driving us away from the diversity that we knew, and which ensures environmental sustainability as well as nutrition security. So we have seen that there is now processes that are beginning to look at developing frameworks that could support farmer seed systems. So there is recognition, yes. At national level, like in Zambia, our laws and policies recognize that farmer seed systems exist. But again, we have also seen that because of this push for Zambia and most Southern African countries to join UPOV under its 1991 standards, we see that at the same time, there is also the corporate push to completely take over the seed market and exclude the farmers. So yeah, those would be my closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tinta. Anne, please, you have that floor.
Thank you very much. I think Lawrence spoke about asking some of the alternatives to the industrial agriculture factory farming model. When you talk about agroecology, I think agroecology is one of the ways we can use, but it will take time to transition to support, because we're seeing also a lot of exploitation in the so-called things like contract farming, factory farming, in terms of, for example, if you look at the poultry industry in the US, the amount of antibiotics used and the infections every time. It is important because in agroecology, we talk about a transition and reduction of the external inputs. It is important. It's one of the ways that we are using. When we work with the farmers on the ground, they are very interested to see some of the ways, for example, to produce their own bio-inputs and biofertilizers to support this transition for food and seed security. And the government is increasingly recognizing, because also of the increasing cases of non-communicable diseases, the cancers, because the intensity of the highly hazardous pesticides being used in the country and the double standards banned in Europe but still being used in Africa is a big challenge in the country. And so it will take some time. It's a process, but we are very keen to build this agroecology movement and work with the scientists, and of course make it something that will work. There was an issue also raised about the issue of GMOs and agrochemicals can distort local markets, making it challenging for agroecological products. Yes, I think that I've alluded to, but also to mention that agroecology, if you look at the principles and even the elements, does not embrace the use of agrochemicals and the intensive use of the synthetic fertilizers. But also, if you can visit the AFSA website, the Alliance of Food Sovereignty in Africa, we're doing a lot of work on even building territorial markets to ensure that we move the food from farm to fork at the cheapest, at a reasonable price that does not make agroecological produced food something that is attracting quite a high price. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Anne. We have 2 minutes to scheduled time. And yeah, I should have done a longer wrap up, but I'll just summarize it in 1 minute and use the other minute to thank everyone here. I think we've had quite a lot of interesting and insightful discussions, including the comments from the audience and from our study. I think Alex has really given us a very good understanding of how DFIs are working through intermediaries, but also the complexity around, how they're involved in making decisions, the complexity of really tracing what funds are coming from DFIs, also issues around accountability, which are difficult because we can't clearly sometimes trace which funds come from DFIs, the involvement in different parts of the food system, including production, processing, up to, the supermarkets. So we've listened to quite a lot of how DFIs are in the different parts of our food systems, but also from the countries, from Kenya, clearly how policies are being influenced, the change in the Seed Act and the Plant Varieties Protection Act. In Zambia, how companies have been bought up and the influence within, the FISP programs. So we've really got a very good sharing on how DFIs are playing a critical role in directing African agriculture, the practices, but also the policies. And I would really like to thank our speakers, Alex, Anne, and Mutinta, for that sharing. Yes, I would also like to thank the audience, our interpreters. Thank you for the job well done. And to Michael, who has really been behind the running of this study, the webinar, and ensuring that everything goes smoothly. Once again, I encourage you to please download the study, read it. There is a lot of insights, but also opportunities for us to develop advocacy strategies. There are some key questions that have come up, for example, around agroecology and compatibility to DFIs. So those might be other opportunities for us to really delve deeper into this subject matter. Thank you once again, and I would like to close this webinar.
Thank you, Bridget, and bye, everyone.
Au revoir et merci.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.
Thank you very much. See you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Bridget, Michael.
Merci beaucoup.